Hi, I'm Luke Muha. Today we're going to talk about pretty much grass, lily pads, and different kind of baits. Doesn't really matter too much about weather as long as it's not raining, that kind of thing. But otherwise, um, today we're going to talk about this kind of grass that you can see in front of me. It's all this kind of like overgrown lily padish type stuff. Sometimes it's right up on shore, sometimes it's out in the middle, kind of like this patch of grass that's sitting right here. But otherwise, different kind of baits such as worms, crankbaits, and that kind of stuff. It works differently in different areas, and usually with lily pads or this overgrown grass that sticks out of the water, I like to use Power Bait by Berkley, one of the greatest assets that fishing has ever seen, that I've seen anyway. Um, but otherwise, I like to use just a Texas rig. Um, Power Bait by Berkley with a slip sinker on it. I have 20-pound braided um, line from Tri-Line. That's always a great asset too, is braided line. You'll never get stuck hung up in a lily pad, and that's mainly people's problems with lily pads, is they get hung up and they can't get the fish out. But otherwise, I use braided and it pulls them out easily. If you can't, then you just let the fish do the work for you. That's also a really big asset. As you just Texas rig, I usually use a 7-inch Berkley Power Bait. Tequila Sunrise is probably my favorite. Otherwise, I like to use green pumpkin, watermelon, or motor oil. And I usually use a kind of like a hook like this. It's just blood hooks. People don't really care about what color the hook is, but I always use a blood hook. It's always my favorite. Um, and then usually with lily pads, most people cast to the edge of them, let it sink, and then the work goes from there. But I like to actually cast into the lily pads or behind the lily pads. In this kind of overgrown grass area, I like to cast behind it if it's offshore. If it's onshore, you kind of cast right in front of it, so you'll get hung up too much. But actually, just sitting here, a couple of bass just jumped right behind that grass area. So just remember, Texas rigging, probably one of my favorite things to do. Um, but we're gonna try this grass area and see how it works. Sometimes you just like to, you can either bob it or you can kind of lightly pull on it, drag it across the bottom. Either or, both work. I usually like to drag it, and then sometimes when you're out in the deeper stuff, like 10 feet, you can just take it and bob it across the bottom. I mean, you don't have to really jerk on it, but just a light bobbing action works. Um, I had one hit there, but didn't feel like taking it today. Today it's about, I don't know, probably 80 degrees. Sun's kind of disappearing at moments, partially cloudy. Supposed to get a front coming in later. Rain always isn't a bad thing when you're bass fishing. Sometimes it helps because then they're feeding and they want to get fed before the rain comes. But a lot of bass also like to not bite before it rains either. Kind of the kicker with some fish. So I see, like right now, I got hung up in this grass stuff, so you kind of just bob it back out of there. And it also doesn't matter about what kind of reel you use. I'm using a Pflueger bait casting reel with a quantum rod. Um, some people don't like to mix and match their rods and reels, but to me it really doesn't really matter as long as you have decent reel, decent rod, that kind of thing. I use I used to use open bail constantly, but I switched to baitcaster a couple weeks ago just due to the casting and then the feel. It really doesn't matter, just as long as you know how to use it, you know how to work your um, lure, where to work it. But I mentioned before about getting hung up on lily pads. I guess it doesn't matter if you use braided or regular line. Ooh, there we go. Right now he's got himself hung up in the lily pads. Like I said before, just let the fish do the work. He usually pulls himself right out of it. Anyways. Right there, nice fish. Texas rig, tequila sunrise. Cast it within, behind, grass areas. It really doesn't matter. Another thing I like to do too is with your hooks. Some barbs, they get really, really tough. But otherwise, in lily pads and grassy areas, you like to keep your barb out. I use, when I'm fishing in the deep, dragging it across the bottom where there's no weeds, I usually push the barb in because there's no casualties with weeds, that kind of thing. And then the hook usually stays in without the barb, but in lily pads you get caught up on that stuff. Otherwise, I have measuring tape on the boat here, and you have a 17-inch bass. It's about 2.5 pounds, nice and fat, mid-July, just after the 4th. Today's the 7th. But otherwise, great fish. Texas rig, any kind of worm would work, but I prefer tequila sunrise. Braided line, baitcaster, doesn't matter. Just use whatever you feel like and you catch fish like this.